幸薄き宿命に泣く妻。
私は夫婦共稼ぎで気楽に働いて3人楽しく日を過ごすことができればと、そればかりを願っているのです。
欲望に走り妻を忘れた男。
ああ、醍醐味だ。天国だ。
陶酔を秘めた魔性の女。
でももうあなたは私のものになりました。これから私のために命を尽くしてくださらなければいけません。
儚い野望の幻に取りつかれた男。
大きな望みを持たずに出世ができるか。望みは大海のごとしか。
運命の濁流に転落する女。
女房がこんなに落ちぶれても、お前が出世すればそれでみんな帳消しさ。さあ、今夜お前もお客になって興行させてもらった方で、落ちぶれ女、この私をお買いよ。私はこの声を聞くたびに体が震えるのです。呪いの声です。断ち切れぬこの世の執着の声。抱いてください。その声は憎らしい。憎らしい。死にきれなかったんだ。死ねなかったんだ。
美しい幻想と厳しい現実との交錯を背景に、巨匠溝口健二が情熱を傾けて描き尽くす生々しい人間の姿。
Good morning. Welcome everyone to Denver Public Library's Saturday Matinee. It really is a pleasure to spend this morning with all of you and our fantastic panel. My name is Daria. Our co-host is Andrew. And today we are supporting the discussion of Ugetsu. Some housekeeping right before we start. Don't worry about taking down any filmography or bibliography. A list will be sent out to you after the event concludes. So don't take any notes, relax, enjoy this, and keep it lively in the chat. If you have any comments about this film, let's discuss it. Use the Q&A function, submit your questions, and we'll pass those on to the panel. And if you have any technical issues, just chat to myself or to Andrew, and we'll do our best to help you out. Now, please give me a hand in welcoming our bomb panel, the film critic Walter Chaw and the filmmaker and actor Alex Winter.
Alex is also a producer extraordinaire and all sorts of things. I have a longer introduction in a minute, but first let's start a little bit with talking about the great director Mizoguchi. He was born in Hongo, province of Tokyo. He was one of 3 children. His father was a roofing carpenter. They came from sort of modest means. In order to try to make a living towards the end of the Russo-Japanese War, the father became sort of an entrepreneur. He tried to sell raincoats. He manufactured the distribution of them, but he started the business a little bit too late towards the end of the war, as sort of a chaotic period. We're familiar with a lot of these images from Ugetsu, right? He was a failed businessman, essentially, and they lost everything. They were so destitute after this failed business venture that the older sister, Suzu, was sold into geishadom from the family. And it obviously had a tremendous effect on Mizoguchi's work for his entire career. He is a passionate and impassioned feminist. I would argue vociferously for that. So some people have argued the opposite, saying, you know, well, he always treats his women so shabbily. But for me, he has such sensitivity towards the plight of women in a patriarchal society, particularly. And the irony is so strong in his movies about the way that women are treated. I can see it as no other way than as a strong feminist statement about how poorly women are treated in this world sometimes. He developed rheumatoid arthritis around 1911. When he was still quite young, he stayed in bed for essentially a year. When we talk about the great filmmakers, a lot of them we find have had some sort of malady in their youth. I've done a lot of work with on Walter Hill recently, and he had bad lungs. He was in his bed reading comic books and watching movies. There's a lot of stories like this, but Mizoguchi was similarly affected physically. He had a limp for most of his life. So when you see depictions of instability, especially physical instability or disability in his pictures, again, that's taken from his own experiences there. He's a ferociously feminist, ferociously personal, intimate, personal, political, social filmmaker. I think all of his works taken together describe a way of living, which is quite extraordinary. He went back to his parents for a year, and then his mother died in 1915. And then Suzu, the sister sold into geishadom, took in her siblings and took care of them. A huge empathy and sympathy and foregrounding that you find with prostitutes, particularly in his movies, is a product of his life experience here. He studied in Tokyo painting, among other things, particularly Western painting techniques. But he said before that the chief influence on the look of his movies is a style of Southern Chinese painting, watercolor painting that was very popular during the Song Dynasty, which ended in about 900, the year 900. In Chinese, the style of watercolor painting, is shui mo, which means water ink, literally water ink. When we talked about Rashomon several weeks ago, a couple months ago now, I think I mentioned that in order for the rain to show up more during the framing sequences in Rashomon, Kurosawa added ink, black ink, to the water so that it'd show up more on the film, in the film. So there's a real technical reason for doing that. But for me, there's also a remarkable cultural callback to this influence of watercolor painting, and especially this Chinese style of shui mo. Shui mo is one of four of the skills that a Chinese gentleman in antiquity was expected to learn. The four others are qing, qi, sui, and hua, su and hua. Okay, so those four, my dad will kill me because my Chinese has gotten very bad in the last 30 years or so. Qing is like a zither, essentially. It's a piano. It's music. Qi is go, the game of Chinese chess. Any good Chinese gentleman should know strategy in chess. Su is the third element. It means book, but it also means calligraphy, like the writing of books, so writing. And hua, the last discipline you should know, is painting, is this painting style. So to become a Chinese scholar, a Chinese gentleman of this period, those were the four distinct things that you must learn. There are a lot of jokes about Asian kids taking violin lessons. It was piano for me. I got hit a lot on my knuckles for not being great at it. Is based on these foundational four tenets of what it means to be a cultured human. That was one of the things that we had to learn. There's 6 elements, and the Chinese like to number things. There's, the gatefold path and all these things. The Chinese are very numerical. I can say these racist things because I am Chinese. I think I can get away with that. I'm not sure. But there are 6 principles to this style of watercolor painting. And the reason I'm going a little bit deeper here is because I believe that Mizoguchi and his visual style and his collaboration with the cinematographer here, Miyagawa, is guided by these 6 principles of this style of Chinese painting. The first one is spirit resonance or vitality. Essentially, what it means is that whether or not your work has soul, and there's this idea that if your work isn't imbued with soul at the very beginning, if you can't feel that it's breathing and alive, a work. One of my best professors in grad school for poetry, he would always ask, where does this poem breathe? And so that's what we're talking about with the first element, the first requirement of Chinese great Chinese watercolor, is the spirit resonance. The second one is bone method. That's the literal translation, and who couldn't use a little work on their bone method? It essentially means how you use the brush, how you hold it, how you are inscribing personality using it. Alex has some experience with animation. There's a sense of the artist's hand being present in these things. That's important. The correspondence to the object, how well you portray the objects, the suitability to type, the application of layers, of value, of tones in your work, the division and the planning of it, the placement, the mise en scène, if you're talking about film and painting, where you place object within a screen, and the transmission of copying, or the copying of models and things like that. Really quickly about Mizoguchi, after training in painting, becoming a writer, all jobs, by the way, that his sister, the young woman sold into geishadom, had found for him as he was struggling to sort of find his way in the world. After this period of time, he discovered film. And in 1923, yep, he made his first feature length film called 813. It was a continuation of the adventures of Lupin, strangely enough. He made, I think, 45 or 46 movies before Ugetsu. Almost all of them have been lost. Of the 75 to 80 movies that he's believed to have made in his lifetime, he remembered 75. Others say he was attributed to as many as 85. Of all of those movies, only 30 survive. The legacy of Japanese film has been interrupted several times by earthquake and natural disaster, also by war. The American firebombing of Japan took a lot of film archives. It's a staggering loss, especially for an artist of Mizoguchi's stature. We will be sending out a filmography and a bibliography of sort of key films from surviving films from Mizoguchi. We'll talk more about it as we talk to our guest today, who is an expert, I think, in a lot of these areas too. So we have today a guy that you'll recognize instantly if you're of a certain age, I think, or just of a certain, I don't know, ethic. I know there's someone in our audience today, Christina. She's a wonderful English teacher at East High School in Denver, and she confided in me yesterday that she's had a crush on Alex for the last 30 years or so. So, Christina, here's your call out to Alex Winter. Hey, who hasn't had a crush? You know, when that opening scene of Lost Boys, you know, on the carousel after Kiefer and, you know, all the guys walk by, the last Lost Boy to walk into frame is Alex walking through like the dancer that he is, a classically trained dancer from a family of dancers, coming around the horse and kind of chewing on, I think, is it a toothpick? I remember when I saw that movie the first time when I was in high school, I was like, that's the one I want to be. So yeah, who hasn't had a little bit of a crush on Alex Winter? He is, you know, a Broadway trained dancer. He was in Peter Pan on Broadway. He was in the King and I. He was in a movie with Charles Bronson, Death Wish 3. Are you kidding me? He's Hollywood royalty. He went to Tisch School of the Arts. He directed short films there, and he directed a couple of amazing films, but a really amazing movie called Freaked. If you haven't seen it, guys, you are missing out. You know, you can mark your life as the time before you saw Freaked and the time after you saw Freaked. It's amazing. He followed it up with another film called Fever. Also, highly recommend that you see that. More recently, he's been involved in making documentaries, really powerful and important ones. He did one about showbiz kids this year that is a must-see. I believe it's on HBO now. You'll correct me if I'm wrong. And he has a movie coming out soon, or it's out now. It's streaming already. It's called Zappa, about the life of one of my personal heroes, Frank Zappa. I loved him dearly for his activism against the censorship of music in the 80s and 90s. That's how I became familiar with him at first. But after watching the documentary, there are lines in it now that my wife and I talk back and forth about each other. My favorite one is about how your productivity as an artist vacillates in direct proportion to how humiliating your day job is that you have to have. That's right. It's amazing. And I was like, that makes me feel better about leaving really well-paying jobs because I couldn't write anymore. For what it's worth, it's making me kind of choked up. So I know Alex to be a strong spokesperson for people who need to be heard. When he said that his favorite movie was Ugetsu and he'd like to talk about it, I immediately saw parallels between the things that Mizoguchi is powerfully motivated by and activist for and active for. The idea of doing the right thing, of prioritizing your family and the little moments of happiness that you can find along the way over status and fame and wealth. Here's a guy in Alex Winter who has embodied all of those things in his life and his career, and no wonder he loves Mizoguchi. It is my great pleasure, my particular honor, to welcome Bill of Bill and Ted. And have you seen the third Bill and Ted, by the way, you guys? It is the perfect movie for this period of time. I watched it right before the election. It made me feel a little bit more hopeful about the world. It talks about hope in our next generation. It's one of the kindest movies that I've seen in a long time. He doesn't really need an introduction, but there's one anyway. Here's Alex Winter. Hi, Alex.
Hey, Walter. Thank you. Thanks so much. That was really lovely. It's really great to be here and good to see you.
Oh, thanks. It's so good to see you as well, man. And let's start with the big stupid question. Why Ugetsu? Why has this film lodged in your heart as your favorite?
Gosh, the shortest answer I can think of, I was a latchkey kid as a kid, and my introduction to cinema, my parents are both modern dancers, and I was trained as a dancer very young, starting with modern, actually, in ballet. I was bad enough at both of those that I gravitated towards tap eventually. But my mother taught dance at Washington University in St. Louis after having her own company, and I would sit in the theater, the movie theater, waiting for her classes to end, very young, like 6, 7, 8 years old, and watch movies. And oftentimes the movies that were playing were silent. So my introduction to cinema was Keaton and Chaplin, but also Carl Dreyer, and it was whatever was playing. I was able to audit the college film course at 12 years old. They just let me take the class. And that's where I learned about Mizoguchi. And so I came to him fairly young. He impacted me in a really powerful way. We talked about this briefly before, but the idea of cinema as a state of dreaming, of conveying abstract but very powerful emotional ideas through imagery and sound and movement. Ugetsu, for me, is one of the purest examples of the synthesis of those things. And even going back to watch it again, I thought, oh gosh, maybe it's not like it wouldn't hold up because I've seen it a fair amount, but I watched it again yesterday, and you're just blown away. It unfolds like a scroll intentionally, and you can't not look at it. Like from the moment he unveils the first tracking shot to the very last tracking shot, which goes the opposite way and then goes up vertically to end, it's just perfect piece of art. So I've always loved this film.
Yeah, and I love that you mentioned the camera movements, and you sort of glanced off of it, but the idea that you wanted to make it like a scroll that was unfolding, like you were literally walking, as the movie's unrolling, if you will, and the fluidity of those shots. The cinematographer on this film also was the cinematographer Rashomon, and he recalls that this was the only time that Mizoguchi, in their long collaboration, I think they made 6 or 7 movies together. Ultimately, that was the only time that Mizoguchi ever praised him for the cinematography of this movie, which says something about Mizoguchi, but also says something about the extreme, I think, beauty of the film. What's your take on the idea of Mizoguchi as a social activist and working within a very strict sort of traditional patriarchy?
I think that now looking back as an adult with children and in a highly charged political world, I think the activism was one of the things that struck me. When I was young, I mean, we're all sensitive, like all human beings are sensitive, right? But I really gravitated towards things that impacted me in that way. I came from a very politically active family, but I was not astute or experienced enough to look at Ugetsu as a political film at that age. Even I think in college, I was really absorbing it as a piece of art first and foremost. But I found that the work just impacted me on this really profound level. It is such a concentrated piece of humanism and every character is given the same weight of humanity, which is often not the case. It's often this person represents X, this person represents Y, here comes the villain, especially in Western stories. And, maybe Darth Vader gets a moment when he dies at the end of the third movie where he finally, but until then, he's just a bad guy. There's nothing like that, especially in Ugetsu. And I love all of Mizoguchi's films that I've seen. But this one is like an unbroken scroll, to be somewhat tacky about my phraseology. It's just perfect. Like every character is so well drawn. So I think there's that moment, when I think it's Ohama when he's having that scene with Wakasa and he's just in bliss. And I've always remember feeling the same, that like, even though all these horrible things are going on and in life and in his film, there is great bliss and moments of great bliss. And that really speaks to me about just humanity and the human experience.
Yeah, that scene you're talking about, I think, is I've never experienced splendor like this, or I've never seen splendor like this. And it's, yeah, I've always wondered if that's where, Splendor in the Grass gets its title. There's so many influences in that you can track to Mizoguchi's movies. The last shot of Sancho the Bailiff is like sort of an unmoored point of view shot that just sort of goes off, and you don't know who the point of view belongs to, just sort of trails off. And I think about the last shot in The Conversation a lot, with the sort of unmanned surveillance camera sort of panning back and forth with the movie brats in the United States were heavily influenced, obviously, by Mizoguchi as well. This guy is so largely, I think, forgotten, and just in terms of like against Ozu or against Kurosawa. What do you think that is, of the three great, I think, undisputed masters of classical Japanese cinema? Why is Mizoguchi the one that people maybe talk about last?
There's two things that there's kind of two tracks for that. There's kind of, for me, speaking personally, just because I love Mizoguchi so much, and I've read, books on Ugetsu, and I love reading material on the making of his films. I think that there's the public. What you hear the most is that his life was cut short, as you said earlier. He was sickly right at the time that he was being recognized by the international community, right at the time the international community was recognizing Japanese cinema, full stop. That you were getting Godard and other people, and he went to Venice with this film. Kurosawa was at the beginning, and just took off. And Ozu, there were so many films that were highly recognized by the international community. Most of Mizoguchi's work precedes that period, and then he died. So he made, Oharu, Ugetsu, and Sancho, and then he was gone shortly after that. So that, I think, had something to do with it. But I would also argue that, and it's something that I think Schrader talks about this in his book on Transcendence, and there are a lot of different theories about cinema and what makes a movie a movie. I think the transcendent style, which Mizoguchi is definitely a leader in, I would argue the leader in, but that's personal taste. I would get into his debate with a film studies person. But I just don't think that's what a lot of people want to watch movies for, sadly. And I don't think it's a great human tragedy, because they exist, but I think people want more, orthodox, conventional storytelling in some form.
Yeah, and they're just to really reduce it down to the base level, they're sort of down movies. They're down endings. They're not movies that you really find a lot of redemptive thing. Like the Seven Samurai, most of them, spoiler alert, don't survive it. But it's actually very uplifting, right? It's exciting and it's heroic, and there's sort of like a purpose to the martyrdom, if you will. And here, the irony is so strong in this film, and it's hardly ever redeemed. There's a film that he did. I'm trying to remember the title of it. As I get older, these things get harder. But that he did, where one of Mizoguchi's films, where the female protagonist has sacrificed everything essentially to put her husband through law school to learn the law, and then she is being tried for a murder that she's done in the process of trying to pay for it, right? And the judge of the trial is her husband, who's become a judge then, and he doesn't let her go. Spoiler alert. But it's like it's an extraordinarily, like, the irony is brutal, and no less so for, like, in this film. I don't know how many times I felt absolutely seen by Mizoguchi in general, but Ugetsu in particular, when the wife is like, why are you trying to make more money? Why are you spending all of this time working? All I want is to sit here with you and our kid not to be a nuisance to you and have to have your attention for a little while.
Yeah.
It's so humbling to watch that as a dad, as a guy who's been, in corporations for 20 some years, and feeling like, why don't I, on my deathbed, I will never look back on my life and wish that I'd worked more.
Exactly. I agree with that. And I also think that to Western audiences, and even to the sort of international film community, even when a film is bleak, it's often adventurous, or there's some romanticizing of or catharsis, even in Shakespeare. Like if you look at King Lear and then you look at Ron, which is pretty bleak, Kurosawa's interpretation of King Lear, it's really about catharsis, and there's a lot of adventure, and it's even the death is grand and crying over Cordelia, and you don't get that in Mizoguchi at all. Like it's there is great beauty, and there is high aesthetic standards, but the aspects of the way life unfolds are just there, and I think that can be off-putting for some people.
Yeah, well, I mean, we talked a little bit earlier about the death of the wife Miyagi in this film, and how stupid it is, how senseless it is, how not glorified or romantic it is, and that has to be a choice, because there's so many ways to film the death of a noble, long-suffering wife, right?
Yeah.
And they're all the ones that I think of are romantic. Like she throws herself into a volcano, or I mean, she learns a little knife fighting and heroically dies fending off 10 bandits to save. But it's not that. It's a drunk, it's an idiot, and a band of idiots. Yeah, it's heartbreaking, really.
And yet, when you've been, I can't speak for you, but when I have encountered really violent or traumatic situations, or been, I lived in New York City during the 70s and was working in Times Square, 70s and 80s. So I would get mugged about once a week, going in or out of the theater. That's the way it always is. Like, that's the way life is quick and haphazard and disjointed. And it's not, and of course, the purpose of drama sometimes is to distill those things and to create kind of cathartic experience out of making something more romantic. I would argue that Mizoguchi is one of the very few artists who succeeds in going the other direction, who, by creating an almost somnambulistic minimizing of these experiences, makes them, I mean, her death is more wrenching and horrifying to me than most things I've seen on screen, specifically because of the way he stages it.
Yeah, there's, this is sort of ancillary to this, but this idea of it being like a dream, a lot of Mizoguchi's movies, the line between reality and dreaming is so thin. And, there's nightmare logic in this movie, and certainly the death of Miyagi is part of that, where it's like, wait, what? What? You're not really sure that what you've seen. And, I wanted to talk with you about the final scene of the film, the final sequences of the film, where the the potter comes home, and let's talk a little bit about that, about the sort of like spinning around and the performance, and the ethic. I know that you read a little bit about the shooting of that scene.
Yeah, it's one of my favorite scenes in all of film, and theater. It's a very theatrical sequence, and Mizoguchi had studied No and Kabuki quite a bit, and No is something in particular that I've studied quite a bit, and several of the actors he was working with had studied No, and there's an unbelievable synthesis in that final sequence, starting with when he walks back into his village. The camera doesn't really stop moving all the way to the end of the film in a very specific manner. And it's an unbroken scroll. He takes you through, and it's not in a self-conscious way or technique over impact or aesthetics. It has a purpose, and the purpose becomes illuminated when he discovers his wife. And that's when you realize there's a method to the whole scroll becomes a micro scroll, where he literally walks in to his empty bedroom, barely goes anywhere. Camera follows him. He walks out. Camera tracks. He walks, and now we reveal his wife there in front of a fire. We just saw that empty piece of set seconds before, and he has no reaction. his reaction is not what our reaction is. Our reaction would be like, wait a minute, she wasn't there a second ago. His reaction is, oh, hey, it's good to see you. I haven't seen you in a while. As if he never did that little circle that he just did. And there's so much beauty in the dream logic of that, that the life is just what he wanted to find. And it synthesizes with the style. And he's one of the, I mean, Dreyer does this really beautifully. It's really hard to do continuous tracking shots like that as a style and not have it be self-conscious, or even I've acted in film sometimes where I've said, do we have to, like, can't I just walk in and grab the thing off the table? You know what I mean? Like, why do we have to do this thing? And in this sequence, everything is for a really beautiful purpose, up to the last shot of the boy putting the honorarium on his mother's grave, and the camera just tracks with him, and then really for one of the first times just goes vertical straight up into the air, and that's it. I mean, I think I've watched that ending 1,000 times over the course of my life. It's perfect.
It is perfect, and I love that the form is actually describing the function, right? The medium is the massage. In Mizoguchi, where at the end of it, there's actually, as down sort of as this an ironic, the voiceover from the dead, you know, how ironic that is. You've become the husband I finally wanted. Too bad I got stabbed in the gut. But when the camera treks up into the heavens, essentially with the child, there is, I actually perversely perhaps feel a lot of hope at the end of this. Like, there is hope in the next generation, right?
I think so. And I also think that there's the word that Mizoguchi had used a lot, even though the film is called a horror film quite a bit, is mystery. And I think that what I personally have loved about transcendent cinema since I was quite young is this idea of mystery. It's not about God or you know, there's a spirituality to it, but it's not overt. But looking at life as mysterious. So however bleak it can be, you don't know where it's going to go. You don't know how it's going to end. And one thing that I know that was imposed on Mizoguchi that I think was the right thing was that his producers required that the young couple did not perish, in which I believe he very eagerly wanted them to.
Yeah.
And they insisted that couple have a more happy ending. And I actually think they're right in the sense it just illuminates his tragedy more. By the fact that it isn't just everyone goes over the cliff at the end, which almost lessens the tragedy, because you don't know how they're like. He's such a loose cannon, this guy. You don't know how that marriage is really going to go. He could take off again the following week. But it's a beautiful way of sort of saying life has mystery, and no human knows all of the answers.
Yeah, and you make a great point about walking a really fine line that tragedy always does. If you go a little bit too far into tragedy, it becomes comedy. You know, it becomes like, it's like I keep trying to tell this and I can never tell it right, but Mel Brooks talks about the difference between comedy and tragedy is, oh, I have a hangnail, it's terrible, it's awful, and comedy is, and the guy walks into an open manhole and dies.
Yeah.
You know, right. There's like a real limit to the extent of which you can really pull out the tragedy. Going back to the murder scene, because it's the most pleasant scene to talk about. Going back to the death of Miyagi, he lingers, right? He stretches it out. It isn't just the poke and she's dead. She gets up and she falls again and she's struggling and she tries to hold on to the child. It's unbearable. And Mizoguchi has said that when I'm getting to an emotional truth in a scene, it's physically painful for me to cut it. It feels like cutting to cut it. So he wants to let it go. And there are examples of that throughout his work. There's in Sancho the Bailiff, the older sister who sold into prostitution in that film. She tries to escape at one point, her life of geishadom, and is caught and then is hamstrung, essentially. Her tendons are cut so that she's no longer able to run. And the way that Mizoguchi shows it is very much like the way that Mizoguchi frames the beheading of the general in Ugetsu, where the camera stays static and it shows the reaction of the people, of all the women, you know, all the other women that are captives. It shows their horror and fear, and it does not show the actual act itself. But you know, he has this sort of remoteness to the way that he shows these things. They're not individual shot cuts like a Fritz Lang would do or something, you know, or Hitchcock even. They're these middle shots, these removed shots of it, which I guess leads to another question. You as an artist and as a director, when do you choose to do medium shots versus when do you choose to do close-ups? And what do you think of his decisions to almost never do close-ups? There's a famous one in Ugetsu, right, where you first see Lady Masaka, but for the most part, all the stuff is done in medium or long shot even.
I think it depends on the story you're telling. I think the form should follow the function in that regard, and he was a master, so he did the same. He was not rigid about employing a style over the substance of what the story was trying to convey. But he was also a master of composition. So, the shot that you had, while there's no cuts, there's an enormous amount of action going on multiple planes. And you have the son, you have her, and then you have the murderers and his compatriots in the background. And there's a whole scene going on behind her that you don't need an edit to watch. You can watch that play out while you watch her thing play out. So I was really, as a student, I learned an enormous amount by watching Mizoguchi movies because of what he could convey in a scene. Also, I had started as an actor in theater, and I'd come up dealing with being directed by theater directors, and where there was similar things where there would be foreground and background happens in a continuous, obviously, proscenium, and the audience's eye gets drawn to one piece or another. And I think that's unbelievably effective. I mean, I love Eisenstein, so I'm not anti-cutting the hell out of something if there's a reason for it and you know what you're doing. But just like you can do what Mizoguchi does poorly, you can do what Eisenstein does poorly. For me, I really Mizoguchi had a theory. My whole film fever was actually really based off of Mizoguchi's what I was learning from him, and it was a very young film for me that was in a way a piece of education, self-education, and I was employing a lot of his techniques. And we actually built sets that we could pull the whole walls off of, and then we put the cameras back on like 200 mil lenses just to shoot a scene between two people without a proscenium, without a front wall, all in one shot. And it was really educational because obviously there's a huge impact, which Dreyer talks about, when you go from employing that style to punching into to close. The Wakasa scene's a really good example of that. It's incredibly powerful, that shot. Everything in that film up till then has been pretty much in wides, and then pow, you're right in on her face. So I tend to use cuts that way. I assume they're going to have an intense impact on an audience, whether you're watching it on a screen or on your laptop. But I love the notion, Mizoguchi's notion that he used to call it leaning in, I think, something in Japanese version of that when you allow a scene to play largely in wides, the audience by nature leans in a little closer than if you're just hammering them with lots of mediums.
Yeah, I've seen that phenomena, and I'm sure you have as well. Particularly when I've shown movies like Rosemary's Baby. There's a scene in Rosemary's Baby, and Polanski is such an architectural director, in many ways, and there's that sort of pan shot and Repulsion that's very much like a Mizoguchi shot. But there's a shot in Rosemary's Baby where Rosemary's on the phone with her OBGYN, Charles Grodin, and she's in the bedroom, and we're in the living room, and it's through the doors, and you hear her, but you can't see her. And if you watch it in an audience, the entire audience lean to try to see around the corner to see through the doorway, and I find myself doing it sometimes when I play video games. I'm like trying to look underneath something. but there's certainly that element where you are physically pulled into a film, and if we can think about when we used to be able to go to watch movies in a theater, there's I think about the Over the Rainbow sequence from The Wizard of Oz a lot. The only sequence in the movie directed by King Vidor, the great silent film director. But the camera movement at the end when she sings "Why Oh Why Can't I" and she looks up, goes all the way around her in sort of a scrolling motion. And it ends up with us looking up. And if you're watching it in like a 1,200 seat theater, like Radio City or something, your eyes are literally tracked upwards, forced upwards by the film to sort of genuflect. It's a moment of religious epiphany at the movies. And I think Mizoguchi understands this from his training as a painter, from his creation of still images. Really remarkable stuff. It just seems like I say that a lot about Mizoguchi. Right.
Yeah, one thing I've done is in Zappa, and I do this in docs a lot. I don't use any medium shots at all when I'm doing interviews. I use extremely close-up shots, and then a big wide master on a wide lens. so that I can stay in the wides as much as possible and really just punch in for emphasis when needed. And it can be glaring. You have to be careful with that, obviously, because you don't want to draw attention to yourself. But I mean, that's, it's an idea I had gotten from him just throughout working and trying different focal lengths on things. And it also tends to, in documentary, it gives it gives more of a performative style to that interview subject and makes it feel less like we just stuck a camera in front of someone in their room and said, start talking to us about things.
Right. Well, that makes me want to mention a really particularly standout sequence in Zappa, and you got to go stream Zappa today. It's really, really great. Even if you're not a fan of the music or don't know very much about Frank Zappa, it talks about the artist life and what it means to be ferociously independent and ferociously creative in the face of, people who don't accept that, and challenging yourself throughout to maintain sort of that level of purity. But when you talk about the way that you shoot interview subjects, there's a sequence in your Zappa film where you go to Ruth Underwood, this really remarkable multi-instrumentalist, xylophone, marimba, all sorts of percussion instruments, but she plays the piano. She plays an entire, she plays like an impossible to play on the piano piece by Zappa on the piano. And it is, the way that it's shot is so, I think you wouldn't perhaps notice how well it's framed because you're blown away by the performance, but I don't think the performance would be as powerful without, what you were just talking about, without the way that you shoot your subjects. So
Thanks. Yeah, it was a great sequence and largely because of Ruth. But I've worked with that DP for years and we've actually tried all kinds of things. We once shot a kids film in Mizoguchi style just for ourselves, almost entirely off a techno crane with continually moving shots. We knew no one was ever going to notice it, but it was informative for us in a cinematic way.
So I mean, really briefly before we jump into some questions, I know something else about Mizoguchi to pull out as people are getting introduced to hopefully to this director and the rest of his works is his passages over water are always for me symbolic in a way that is only probably matched by Hitchcock, who has really meaningful passages over water as well. But the passage over water sequence in this movie is sort of aborted midway and then sort of kind of rolled back. And Sancho the Bailiff, the passage over water is completed to tragedy. I wonder if you could talk about some of these visual themes, these visual thematics and metaphors and allegories that show up in Mizoguchi, not just the water, but images of grass, images of hearth, and in particular that Splendor in the Grass sequence, but also when we first see the Wasaka Manor and everything is blocked off. One of the awesome peculiarities of Japanese architecture is everything is already kind of broken up into shadow boxes, into woodcuts, into wood blocks, if you will. It's like a rear window naturally, right? So if you could talk a little bit about some of those elements, and then we'll jump into some
Sure. For me, I love John Ford. I think you can't not love John Ford. I think Mizoguchi has a better eye than John Ford. I think he's got a better eye than Kurosawa. But all three of them are very good at what you're describing. But there's a way in which Mizoguchi works with the presence of shape and form, but also nature and its interrelationship with the characters and their emotional state. That's pretty unmatched. I think I love the Tarkovsky film Ivan's Childhood, which was very influenced by Mizoguchi. Tarkovsky has spoken about that, which does some similar things in that film to what Mizoguchi does in this film, especially with the manor house and the framing of shape and form and how it relates. But the oftentimes I didn't find too many of the Japanese films, historical films, of which this is obviously one. This is a 16th century historical feudal film. It's really representative of modern Japan. And the modern Japanese Life of a Haru, I would say similarly, the modern Japanese and modern human emotional condition. So he's using these frames, he's using the abstraction almost like Beckett, where you clear everything away other than just the simplest things that you need. So the scenes in the manor are just exquisitely framed to convey something very specific, but he's not precious. By the end, Oham is literally smashing through screens to try to get out of there, and he's disrupting all the lines, all of the perfect, exquisite lines, and over and over again. And then the scene by the lake that you described with the tree and the water, it could have been extremely cliche. But it really tells you about the sort of the infinity of spirit, and so his when he says, "I've never imagined such splendors existed," he's not just a someone who's become corrupted. He's really connecting with the spirit of life in a very meaningful, profound way, and it just makes the tragedy that much more heart-wrenching. So I could talk about that stuff all day long, but I find a purity to the way he works in terms of his framing and the way he uses nature, which is much harder to do, I think, than it looks.
Well, the opening of the scene, the way that splendor scene is introduced, is with a series of carefully groomed lines that I've come to associate with, like, Japanese prayer gardens, if you will, with the sand that's been sort of raked in a circle and everything. And there's a certain perfection to that scene that I find to be ironic, because nature is messy, and this, and for him to be in this, you're cued to the sort of uncanniness of that situation.
Yeah.
Like, it is too perfect, perhaps.
Yeah, it almost looks like a shot out of Blade Runner. You know what I mean? It
does.
almost looks like a
Yeah.
simulacrum.
It is exactly that. It's literally that in the film. It's a simulacrum. It's a projection. It's like that Ray Bradbury short story, Mars is Heaven.
Yeah, I
Right?
love that. Yeah,
It's the best short story ever written, maybe.
Yeah.
That's hyperbolic, but it's really fucking good. And
Yeah.
essentially, if you haven't read it, it's about astronauts that go to Mars, and it's just Iowa. It's a summer evening in Iowa, right?
Yeah.
But it's something different than it actually is. It actually appears to be, and that's what my feeling of Wasaka Manor and all that is this sense of absolute uncanniness. This is everything that he's ever wanted. A beautiful woman of class and style who really appreciates his art and understands that it's worth dying for. And now I'm going to be enfolded into my biggest fan. But like Misery, your biggest fan is not often the best thing in the world. And so there's but he cues us to this, Mizoguchi does, throughout the sequences where it's too perfect, and there's this uncanniness to it that is startling. And even if you don't note it sort of consciously, I think it nests in your heart when you're watching it. You're like, something's not right. Like the steam sequence when she steps in and she's still wearing a kimono and everything. Like,
it's amazing.
Yeah, it's beautiful and also weird,
disturbing.
Disturbing. It is disturbing. And the thing that I think that we underappreciate about how disturbing some of those sequences actually are, how uncanny, is that the whole movie, I think, seems to us culturally uncanny in a way, and we want to forgive it. We want to say that's just a Japanese thing. That's just that's just the way they are. The culture is different. That's how they. I don't think so, because I've not seen that in the movies. There's something very uncanny that he's communicating through these pictures. The finding the ghost ship, and then the boatman raising and says, "No, I'm not a ghost." Like, are you sure? There's the sense of high level of uncertainty that goes through this film, where you are questioning throughout. Do I know? Do I actually know what's happening? Do I know the timeline even? And he comes out of the house, and the guy's like, "The store's been missing for a month." I'm like, where have you? How long has he been here? When did it go missing? What's happening? How long has he been lying in the field? Is he dead? The sense of uncertainty. Every time I watch it, it seems a little different. Where I'm focused, like, did that happen?
Yeah, he plays with time in an interesting way, even at the beginning of the film. And I remember that from when I saw it before. And it was reinforced when I watched it yesterday. The whole sequence where the army is descending upon the village. It's like a Hitchcock protracted time thing. Like, it doesn't make sense that they could hang on as long as they could and not get caught, because they're right there. It's like a nightmare when you're being chased and someone's on you and they're on you and they're on you and they're on you, and yet you keep running. And it gives the sequence, like, it makes you nauseous, and he's stoking the kiln and trying to get the pottery done. And they're like, you guys, they're literally right there. But the way he cuts it and the way the sequence is played out, they just don't get there until they get there. I find he protracts time. I'm not sure if he really does that so much in Oharu, in that way. So it's certainly something that he plays with here.
Yeah, I mean, more so in Sancho, I think,
Right.
Which is another really hallucinogenic sort of feeling film.
Yeah.
I would want to segue into a conversation about the score overall and exactly how sound is used in this movie super effectively. But I would also say that I'm playing a game on my PlayStation called Sekiro, which is a action game set during exactly this period of time. And there's, believe me, plenty of firearms. But let me sort of Alex speak to the use of sound and the use of diegetic sound and also score particularly gunfire, and how alarming actually the crackling is when you hear it in the distance, when they're like having a campfire just outside of town, and you
Yeah.
hear all the probably executions that are going on back in the village. Anyway, yeah, Alex, what are your thoughts?
Well, the sound is beautiful in the film, and the score is a no based score. So it has it underscores, literally underscores the theatrical aspects of the film. And from what I remember reading about it, Mizoguchi wasn't radically involved in that. There were other people who were more heavily involved in the score, though obviously he supervised everything. Um, in terms of the gunshots, though, the this is something we spoke about before. The film is like a dream, and all of the violence in the film is extremely dreamlike and not literal at all. The way Miyagi is killed, the way he gets the head from the other samurai by just kind of sort of poking around on his wardrobe until he expires. I mean, it's extremely it's but I've always really I found it very purposeful, and even the way Ohama Lee's like just swinging that sword around and like not making purchase on anything. Um, it's really very much like being in a nightmare or a dream where there's a clumsiness and an unsatisfying lack of contact and finality to anything that makes it more disturbing. I find the scene where he gets the head to be so disturbing because he's not a fighter and he's up against a warrior and he barely has to do it's really like a dream. He barely has to do anything to vanquish this guy. And so to me, all of that is about saying the world is a big, super scary place, and you're this kind of fumbling, bumbling sleepwalker, kind of ambling your way through it, which I find has a lot of thematic resonance.
Well, and there's so many ironies too, I think, related to fame and related to sort of the things that we prioritize in our culture, that so many of these things are happened upon by the worst people.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the worst human being on the planet was the president for 4 years. What happened here? And it's so discouraging, these sort of dramatic ironies. You talk about the general being, felled, and then the irony of, this harsh social criticism embedded in all of a sudden all the samurai are like, this is the best samurai, and hey, samurai boss, let's stop here at the brothel. The harsh irony of fame and
Yeah.
fortune, and how it's leveled sometimes on and even for the people who receive it. And you know about this better than I would. Your movie about Hollywood kids is heartbreaking and extraordinary at the same time. But showbiz kids is this idea that for the people that we covet their positions the most, those things are not often gifts. Those not often good things.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, it's people die in the airlessness of that attention.
Yeah.
And certainly in this movie too, you have that sort of harsh irony of he gets everything that he wants, but he loses the only thing that's important.
Yeah.
And that's something that's really strong in Mizoguchi as well. And another reason that I don't want to embarrass you, but I've so admired and been grateful to know you. The idea that this person that has been such an integral part in so many of our lives, and we imagine certain things about you, to find that in this part, it's like Paul Stanley, right? Like, man, this is a really good human being. And probably as a product of all of this stuff, rather than as an accidental byproduct of whatever, right?
Yeah, I mean, life is life. Kurosawa had an extraordinary childhood as well, with a lot of tragedy that certainly informed his art and the way he came at humanist art. Not unlike Mizoguchi's, just swap genders but siblings and losing his brother to suicide. And there's a lot there. And coming up as a child actor is it's not it's not all squeaky clean and fun. So a lot of the darker aspects of that have informed my art and work as an adult.
Why don't we go to Aaron's question? It was a twofold. They're interested to hear more about how transcendental cinema works and about the visual techniques that are like parts of it. But the second part of the question was, what heirs to Mizoguchi that are currently making interesting work, in your, Walter, and Alex's opinion?
Well, two parts to that answer. The first thing that I'm going to defer to Alex to talk about Paul Schrader's landmark book of film criticism about transcendental cinema. He covers Ozu and Dreyer, really remarkable work that has held up over the years. For the longest time, it was really difficult to get, but I think it's been reprinted. Yeah, and it's really fascinating. I got the chance to talk with Schrader about it at one point. And man, he knows stuff. I want Alex to talk a little bit about his perspective on that book. But for me, the clearest modern antecedent that I see to Mizoguchi, and you see echoes of him a lot, just in style and form. But in terms of thematics and also style and form, I think of Terrence Malick a lot. Alex, maybe you could disagree, but Terrence Malick is so interested in nature and man's sort of antagonistic tension with nature, including his own nature. There'll be, especially like I'm thinking of stuff like Thin Red Line or The New World, where he'll have these long meditative sequences where he's looking at nature and having his characters regard nature. And in the midst of it, there's this little war that's going on between the humans, and it's so meaningless. And maybe your wife is sleeping with somebody else back at home, and maybe there's it's also Pyrrhic, these little victories that men win along the way. And so thematically, it really allies itself with Mizoguchi. But Mizoguchi was also very fond of shooting at the twilight hour. He would wait until the sun was just about to set, and he would start rolling, which is an interesting thing to say, because I think of the twilight hour as a golden hue, but these are clearly black and white movies. But when you look at the movies, I feel like you can see them. I have this thing that I say that, black and white was never black and white. And it's never more true than I think in Mizoguchi. There's a great anecdote I heard about Nick Nolte on the set of Thin Red Line, saying that he delivered his GD dialogue 20 times, and he noticed that Malick was not watching, but he kept having him do it over and over again. And then he realized that the camera wasn't even rolling. And then finally, at the end of a day of him doing this horrible monologue over and over again, Malick says, "Okay, go." And all Malick was doing was waiting for the light to be right. He didn't really care about the word. And so for me, Malick is, I think, the clearest, in my mind, full inheritor of Mizoguchi. But, Alex, maybe speak to that and also to Transcendental cinema.
Well, the book is great, and it gets into those filmmakers, and then it was expanded to include Tarkovsky and Bellatar and some other filmmakers. There's a term that came out of it. I wouldn't say I bump on it, because that's not fair to someone who's a much better film studies person than I am in Paul Schrader. But this term slow cinema, which I bump on a little, because I don't think the films need to be slow to be transcendent. But that's sort of what you think of when you think of these filmmakers sometimes. I think Terrence Malick is a great example of transcendent cinema that does not need to be slow. In fact, a lot of his films have a real vitality to them and dynamism to them, even though they are very transcendent. We don't have, you could spend 2 hours on this. So like for me, quickly, there's a way of coming at story that is more using the mise-en-scene, more using the movement of camera, how the actor moves, how much dialogue you do or don't use, not just using each scene to get from, through certain obvious Aristotelian beats, but to convey an idea. But there is story there. It is not just a piece of filmed sculpture. And Mizoguchi, he's not even in that book, I would argue is the best at this of all of them. But today you have like Chloe Zhao, who just did Nomadland. I think a lot of them are coming up from under Malick, but certainly by way of what came before Malick. Malick is really influential at the moment, and obviously has influenced everybody from TV shows to Gus Van Sant movies and everyone in between. But I think that the transcendent style is very well exemplified by Ugetsu and all of the things that we just described in detail. Another great film for me is Dreyer's Day of Wrath, which is really a story told. It's extremely dramatic and has a lot of plot, actually, but is told almost entirely through composition, camera movement, production design, and how the actors move. And the story kind of comes through that. And I love that kind of cinema. It's just very, very hard.
Yeah, I mean, and I think the idea of slow cinema for me is that concept of leaning in that you mentioned. It's not so much about length; it's about the amount that you have to work for it. When the amount that you are pulled in and forced to be a human as you're watching the film, bring your own experiences into consideration of it.
I think Affliction is a really good example of that from Schrader. It's one of my favorite sort of more transcendent styled movies of his. It's
I love Addiction. Yeah.
Yeah, I do too. Yeah.
Oh, and First Reformed. More,
Yeah.
more recently.
Yeah,
Oh my
agreed,
God.
yeah. Yeah.
First Reformed. You mentioned Chloe Zhao. I also think of Kelly Reichardt. You know, there are a lot of great,
Absolutely.
women filmmakers. She did First Cow this year, which is
Yeah.
very transcendental. But there's, there's an interesting legacy with Mizoguchi too, where, his actress in this film and several others, Tanaka Kinuyo, she became a director herself. She directed 6 movies, and she did a movie called Love Letter, which is about a soldier who comes home from the war to find out that his wife has slept with an American soldier. So the connections to Malik extend beyond just Mizoguchi, but the people with whom Mizoguchi worked. And I don't want to take away anything from Tanaka, because she is a remarkable filmmaker of her own right. I mean, she extended her own self, and she applied, I think, at one point to be part of the Directors Guild in Japan. And she was supported by Ozu, but she was denied. She was like sort of, she was not supported by Mizoguchi. And, another story from Mizoguchi's personal life is that around the time of Ugetsu, I think he was hospitalized for a while because he was slashed with a razor horribly by the prostitute that he was living with at the time. So there's something going on with him that I find to be fascinating, that this person who's so progressive in his work perhaps was still trapped in certain cycles of systemic patriarchy and misogyny in his life, unavoidably, perhaps. And, it speaks to this idea. And, he even made a movie about that, essentially, about, he about a woman who leaves her husband, who is a liberal politician, but at home he's a sort of authoritarian nightmare. But she leaves with the housemaid who has had an affair with the husband, and the two of them start like a foundation together. And it's a remarkable film, a super strong, positive feminist film from Mizoguchi. And how does a flawed person make great social art like that? I'd say the same about Hitchcock. I mean, it's complicated, right? Yep. It's complicated. Far be it from me to try to figure out people. But all right, so I think we've sort of reached our limit. I don't want to impose too much more on your time. I know you're a busy guy. Guys, watch Zappa, watch Freaked. I know you've already seen the 3 Bill and Ted movies, but if you haven't, especially if you have kids, time to watch those movies. They are so kind, you guys. And the second one pays tribute to Bergman. It's a great entry point to the it's a great entry point to Bergman, who is much more fun in body than you think. But Alex is a force for good in the world, and I'm so very proud to have him here and doing this great program for the Denver Public Library. Alex, thank you so much for your time today.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. That was great. It was an honor to be here. Thank you.
Alex, honor is all ours. Thank you so much.
All right, quick thing for next week. We have the great Peter Ramsey, the Academy Award winner for Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse, joining us to talk about Let the Right One In, the wonderful vampire film. I won't tell you why Peter chose that movie. Maybe he'll tell you why. But it'll be really fun to talk with Peter next week, and I hope you guys can join us then.